The drone's camera feed crackled as it streamed live footage back to the research team gathered at the entrance of the tunnel. The group of five stared intently at the monitor, captivated by the eerie silence and the unsettling darkness captured on the screen. The abandoned train tunnel, once part of an old railway line in rural Pennsylvania, had been sealed off for decades, shrouded in mystery and grim local legends. Suddenly, the image on the screen flickered. The drone's light, a single beam piercing the darkness, illuminated something unusual, piles of what looked like shredded clothing scattered across the tunnel floor. It moved closer. The researchers leaned in, their breaths held in unison. A shadow darted across the camera's view. At first, it was a blur, like a ripple in the air. Then came a sound, a low, guttural growl that reverberated through the tunnel and out into the still night air. The drone's camera swung sharply, its feed becoming jittery, as if something had struck it midair. "What was that?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling. The screen cleared, showing the source of the noise. It was a figure human-like, but wrong in every possible way. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over its skeletal frame. Its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the drone's light like a predator's. And its mouth, lined with sharp, jagged teeth, opened in a shriek so loud that the researchers instinctively covered their ears, even though it came from the drone speakers. "It's coming!" shouted Daniel, the team leader. Before they could react, the figure lunged at the drone. The feed cut out, plunging the screen into static. A sudden, echoing roar from within the tunnel sent the team scrambling for their equipment and running for their vehicles. As they fled, the earth seemed to rumble beneath their feet, and an unmistakable scraping sound, like nails on stone, grew louder behind the M. 2 weeks earlier, the team had first gathered in the cramped basement of a university building. Daniel, a seasoned archaeologist, stood at the head of the table, holding a set of old blueprints and a faded map. "This," he said, pointing to the map, "is the abandoned Rock Ridge Tunnel. It's been sealed for over 50 years, and no one really knows why. But these," he gestured to the blueprints, "show an underground chamber within the tunnel that's never been documented anywhere else. It could be an old storage room, a shelter, or something entirely different. Whatever it is, it's worth investigating." Emily, a young geologist with a knack for uncovering hidden spaces, nodded enthusiastically. "If it's been sealed that long, there could be artifacts, things preserved for decades. Or," joked Ryan, the tech specialist, "it could just be full of bats and rusty train parts." The others laughed nervously, but Daniel was serious. "Well, use the drone to explore first. No one goes inside until we know what we're dealing with. The local legends are unsettling." "What kind of legends?" asked Sarah, a historian. Daniel hesitated. "People say there were disappearances near the tunnel back in the 70s, hikers, mostly. Locals avoid it completely. There are stories about strange noises, shadows that move on their own, and a creature that—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "It's just folklore. Let's focus on the facts." The team spent the next few days preparing their equipment. A state-of-the-art drone with high-definition cameras, motion sensors, and thermal imaging. Emily and Sarah pored over geological maps of the area, while Ryan ensured the drone software was glitch-free. By the time they arrived at the site, they were confident and ready, at least that's what they told themselves. The entrance to the Rock Ridge Tunnel was overgrown with vines and surrounded by dense woods. A rusted metal gate, secured with a thick chain, barred the way inside. Daniel used bolt cutters to remove the chain, and the team stepped back as he swung the gate open. "It's colder than I expected," Emily murmured, hugging her jacket closer. A chill seemed to emanate from the tunnel's mouth, despite the warm autumn day. They set up their base camp just outside, positioning a portable monitor and connecting the drone to its controls. Ryan activated the drone, and its rotors hummed to life. "Here we go," he said, guiding it into the tunnel. The bright beam of the drone's light cut through the inky darkness, revealing damp walls streaked with mold and graffiti. For the first half hour, the tunnel seemed ordinary enough, just a long, straight passage with tracks partially buried under dirt and debris. But as the drone ventured deeper, the atmosphere shifted. The air appeared heavier, and strange sounds began to filter through its microphone's soft whispers, the faint creak of metal, and once what sounded like distant laughter. "Probably just wind," Ryan said, though his hands trembled slightly on the controls. The drone's sensors detected an open space ahead, signaling the chamber marked on the blueprints. The researchers exchanged excited glances as the camera feed revealed a large, cavernous room. Its walls were lined with shelves, some still holding crates and barrels covered in decades of dust. "Jackpot," Emily said, leaning closer to the monitor. "This must have been some kind of storage facility." "Scan for artifacts," Daniel instructed. Ryan maneuvered the drone, its camera panning across the chamber. The team spotted rusted tools, broken lanterns, and what looked like old journals, their pages brittle and yellowed. But then, as the drone moved toward the far wall, something caught its light, a dark stain smeared across the floor, leading to a pile of tattered clothing. "What the—" Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. The pile wasn't random. It was arranged deliberately, as if someone or something had placed it there. Before anyone could comment, the drone sensors picked up movement. The team froze, watching as the camera captured a fleeting shadow darting across the chamber. "Ryan, pull it back," Daniel ordered, his tone urgent. "I'm trying," Ryan replied, his fingers fumbling with the controls. The drone swiveled, its light falling on the figure that had appeared behind it. The feed went static. Back in the present, the team sat in Daniel's SUV, their hearts racing as they sped away from the tunnel. The sound of scraping claws on stone still echoed in their minds, and no one dared to speak. They had left behind their equipment, their notes, everything. "Did you see its eyes?" Emily finally asked, her voice shaking. "They weren't human." "What do we do now?" Sarah whispered. Daniel tightened his grip on the steering wheel. "We regroup, and we figure out what the hell we just found." Before anyone could respond, a loud thud landed on the roof of the car, causing it to swerve violently. Everyone screamed as another thud followed, then silence. For a moment, no one moved. The SUV sat motionless on the dark, empty road. Inside, the team huddled together, their breaths shallow and ragged. Whatever had landed on the roof was no longer making noise, but the tension in the air was suffocating. "Did you hear that?" Emily whispered, gripping the seatbelt across her chest. "No," Ryan said shakily. "I felt it." Daniel slowly reached for the glove compartment, pulling out a flashlight. His knuckles were white as he gripped it. "Stay inside," he said, his voice low but firm. "Wait. You're not actually going out there, are you?" Sarah hissed. "We can't just sit here," Daniel replied, though the fear in his eyes betrayed his confidence. "Whatever it is, we need to know if it's still out there." Against the protests of the group, Daniel opened the driver's side door. The dome light illuminated the interior for a split second before he ducked shut again, plunging them back into near darkness. Daniel's flashlight beam cut through the night as he stepped around the vehicle, scanning the roof and the nearby trees. The road was eerily quiet. No wind, no crickets, just the faint hum of the SUV's engine. Daniel's light swept over the roof, revealing deep scratches gouged into the metal. His breath hitched. "Do you see anything?" Ryan called from inside. Daniel didn't answer. He crouched, inspecting the scratches. They were long and precise, as though made by claws. Large ones. "Daniel?" Emily's voice cracked, louder this time. Before he could respond, a loud rustling came from the trees lining the road. He swung the flashlight toward the noise, the beam dancing across the dense foliage. Something was there. He couldn't see it clearly, but the outline was unmistakable. Tall, hunched, and moving with a disturbing, jerky gait. He stumbled back toward the car, his heart pounding. "Get ready to drive," he shouted. But as he turned, the thing emerged from the shadows. It was faster than he expected. Pale skin gleamed under the flashlight, and its glowing eyes locked onto him with a predatory focus. It shrieked, a high-pitched, piercing sound that made Daniel's ears ring. The creature lunged. Daniel barely made it back into the car, slamming the door shut as the thing collided with the side of the vehicle. The force rocked the SUV, and the team screamed as the creature clawed at the windows, its jagged teeth bared. "Go! Drive!" Daniel shouted. Ryan didn't need to be told twice. He scrambled over the console into the driver's seat and slammed his foot on the gas. The tires screeched as the SUV lurched forward, throwing everyone against their seats. The creature chased them. Its inhuman speed allowed it to keep pace with the vehicle, its claws scraping against the back window. Emily covered her ears, trying to block out the screeching sound. "How is it so fast?" Sarah cried, tears streaming down her face. Ryan floored the accelerator, pushing the SUV to its limits. The creature faltered briefly, falling behind, but then leapt forward with alarming agility, landing just inches from the rear bumper. It struck the back window, cracking the glass. Daniel reached for a metal tool stashed in the Cara tire iron and turned to face the creature. "Keep driving," he yelled. "Don't stop." The thing reared back, preparing to strike again. Daniel swung the tire iron through the cracked glass, hitting the creature's arm. It shrieked and recoiled, momentarily losing its grip. The SUV surged ahead, and the creature disappeared into the darkness. They drove for miles, hearts pounding, before Ryan finally slowed down, pulling into a gas station lit by flickering fluorescent lights. The SUV was a wreck. Scratches covered its sides, the back window was shattered, and the roof was dented. No one spoke as they stumbled out of the car, leaning against the hood to catch their breath. The adrenaline was beginning to wear off, and the reality of what they had just experienced was sinking in. What was that thing?" Emily finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," Daniel said, running a hand through his hair. "But it's not human." Ryan paced nervously. "We need to report this. The police, the forest rangers, someone." Daniel shook his head. "And tell them what? That we were attacked by a monster? They'll think we're insane." "It's not just a monster," Sarah said, her voice trembling. It was smart. Did you see the way it moved? It knew what it was doing." Emily shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. "And it's still out there." For a moment, silence fell over the group. The gas station lights flickered, casting strange shadows across the cracked pavement. Ryan finally broke the silence. "What do we do now?" Daniel straightened, his jaw set. Go back." Emily's head snapped toward him. "What? Are you crazy?" "No," Daniel said firmly. "We need to know what that thing is, where it came from, why it's in the tunnel. If we leave this alone, it's just going to keep happening." "And what if it kills us next time?" Sarah said, her voice rising. "Well, go prepared," Daniel insisted. "Better equipment, better weapons. We'll bring reinforcements if we have to. But we can't just walk away from this." Ryan stared at him like he had grown a second head. "You saw what it did to the drone, to the car, to us. And you want to go back?" "Yes," Daniel said, his tone unyielding. Because if we don't, no one else will. And whatever that thing is, it's not staying in that tunnel forever. Emily, Sarah, and Ryan exchanged uneasy glances. None of them wanted to go back, but deep down, they all knew Daniel was right. Something was in that tunnel, something dangerous and unexplained, and it wasn't going to stay hidden for long. Just as they were beginning to discuss their next steps, the faint sound of static crackled from the car. The team froze, their eyes darting toward the vehicle. "That's impossible," Ryan said. "The drone's feed was destroyed." The static grew louder, interspersed with faint, garbled noises, voices, distorted and faintly human. Then, clear as day, a single word emerged from the static. "Come." The sound cut off abruptly, plunging them into silence. The team stared at each other, wide-eyed and pale. "We're not alone," Emily whispered. Before anyone could respond, the gas station lights flickered and went out, leaving them in total darkness. The darkness at the gas station was suffocating, broken only by the faint glow of the moon overhead. The team froze, their breath caught in their throats. In the silence, the static sound from the car began again, louder this time, almost deafening. "Turn it off," Sarah whispered, clutching Emily's arm. "It's not on," Ryan hissed back. He reached for his phone, fumbling with the flashlight app, but the screen stayed black. "My phone's dead. It had full charge a minute ago." Emily and Sarah checked their own phones, their panic growing as they found the same. "What's happening?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. Daniel stepped toward the SUV, his flashlight now the only source of light. Its beam wavered as his hand shook. The static from the car stopped abruptly, replaced by silence so complete it felt unnatural. Then, a faint scratching sound echoed from the woods behind the gas station. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "Stay close to the car," Daniel said, his voice low but commanding. He tightened his grip on the tire iron. "If anything moves, get inside and lock the doors." They huddled together near the SUV, scanning the surrounding darkness. The scratching sound grew louder, coming from multiple directions now. The shadows seemed to shift, as if something or many things were moving just beyond the edge of the flashlight's beam. Then, they saw it. From the tree line, two glowing eyes appeared, reflecting the faint moonlight. They were joined by another pair, then another. The team's collective breath caught as more and more eyes emerged from the woods, all of them fixed on the group. "Are there more of them?" Emily stammered, gripping Sarah's arm tightly. "No," Ryan said, backing toward the car. "No way. This can't be real." The creatures stepped closer, their pale forms emerging from the shadows. There were at least 5 of them, each as gaunt and twisted as the one they had encountered before. Their movements were erratic but deliberate, their glowing eyes locked on the team. "Get in the car," Daniel shouted. They scrambled for the doors, piling into the SUV as the creatures advanced. Daniel jumped into the passenger seat while Ryan took the wheel. He jammed the keys into the ignition and turned them, but the engine only sputtered. Come on," Ryan yelled, frantically trying again. The creatures were closing in, their jagged claws scraping against the pavement as they approached. One of them lunged, slamming into the side of the car. The force rocked the SUV, and the team screamed. The creature's face pressed against the window, its glowing eyes unblinking as it bared its sharp teeth. "Try again," Daniel shouted. Ryan turned the key once more, and this time the engine roared to life. He floored the accelerator, sending the SUV screeching forward. The creature holding onto the side was flung off, but the others gave chase, their unnatural speed keeping them close to the vehicle. "Faster!" Sarah screamed, clutching the seat in front of her. "I'm going as fast as I can," Ryan shot back, sweat dripping down his face. The SUV hurtled down the road, its headlights cutting through the darkness. The creatures didn't slow, their pale forms darting in and out of the shadows. One leapt onto the back of the car, its claws digging into the already damaged roof. "Get it off!" Emily cried. Daniel twisted in his seat, swinging the tire iron through the broken back window. He struck the creature's arm, but it didn't budge. Instead, it let out a piercing shriek that made everyone's ears ring. Another creature lunged at the side of the car, its claws scraping against the metal. "Hold on!" Ryan shouted, jerking the steering wheel to the right. The sudden swerve sent the creature on the roof tumbling off, and the others faltered momentarily. The SUV roared onto the main highway, the smooth asphalt allowing Ryan to pick up speed. The creatures fell behind, their forms fading into the distance. For a moment, it seemed they were safe. Ryan didn't slow down, his knuckles white as he gripped the wheel. "Is everyone okay?" he asked, his voice shaky. No one answered. They were too busy catching their breath, their wide eyes darting around the dark road, half expecting the creatures to reappear at any moment. Finally, Daniel broke the silence. "We need to figure out what those things are, where they came from. This is bigger than us." "Are you serious?" Ryan snapped, his voice rising. "We almost died, and you still want to go back?" "Think about it," Daniel said. "If there are more of them, they could be spreading. What if they leave the tunnel? What if they start attacking people?" "They already are attacking people-us," Sarah shot back. "And you want to go looking for them?" Before Daniel could respond, the static sound returned. This time, it wasn't coming from the car. It seemed to echo from all around them, growing louder and louder until it was nearly unbearable. "Where's that coming from?" Emily asked, covering her ears. Ryan slowed the car, his hands shaking. "I don't know." The static abruptly stopped, replaced by a deep, guttural voice. It sounded distorted, as if coming through a broken speaker, but the words were unmistakable. "You cannot escape." The SUV's headlights flickered, and then the engine sputtered. The car slowed to a crawl before stalling completely, leaving them stranded in the middle of the empty highway. "No, no, no!" Ryan shouted, frantically turning the key in the ignition. The engine refused to start. "What do we do?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. Before anyone could answer, a loud thud came from the roof, then another, and another. The car rocked violently as if something or several somethings had landed on top. "Get out!" Daniel shouted. "Run!" They flung the doors open and spilled onto the road, the cool night air biting at their skin. The creatures were back, their glowing eyes visible in the darkness. One leapt from the roof of the car, landing just feet away from Emily. She screamed and stumbled backward, her legs shaking too much to run. Daniel grabbed her arm, pulling her to her feet. "Go! Keep moving!" The group ran down the highway, their footsteps pounding against the asphalt. The creatures followed, their shrieks echoing through the night. Emily glanced back and saw one of them gaining on Sarah, its claws outstretched. "Sarah, look out!" she screamed. The creature lunged, its claws grazing Sarah's arm as she veered to the side. She cried out in pain but kept running, clutching her injured arm. The team spotted a cluster of abandoned buildings ahead, their dark silhouettes barely visible against the night sky. It was their only chance. Without speaking, they sprinted toward the nearest building, a crumbling warehouse with shattered windows and rusted doors. "Inside! Now!" Daniel shouted. They barreled through the broken doors, slamming them shut behind them. Ryan and Daniel shoved a nearby shelf against the doors, creating a makeshift barricade. The creatures outside shrieked and pounded against the metal, their claws scraping like nails on a chalkboard. The team huddled together, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. "What now?" Ryan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Daniel looked around the dimly lit space, searching for anything they could use as a weapon or defense. "We hold them off," he said, "and we find a way to survive." Before anyone could respond, a loud crash echoed through the warehouse. One of the creatures had broken through a side window, its glowing eyes scanning the room. "They're inside," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. The team backed away as more creatures crawled through the broken windows, their twisted forms silhouetted against the faint moonlight. They were surrounded. Daniel tightened his grip on the tire iron, his jaw set. "Stay behind me," he said. "Whatever happens, we stick together." The first creature lunged, and the fight for survival began. The creature lunged at Daniel with terrifying speed, its claws slashing through the air. He swung the tire iron with all his strength, the metallic clang of the impact reverberating through the crumbling warehouse. The blow sent the creature staggering back, but it recovered almost instantly, letting out a bone-chilling shriek. "Run!" "Da!" Neil shouted, keeping himself between the group and the advancing creatures. "Find a way out!" The others hesitated for a split second before bolting toward the far end of the warehouse, where the faint outline of a back door was visible. The creatures swarmed into the room, their pale forms illuminated by the weak moonlight streaming through the broken windows. They moved erratically, yet there was an eerie intelligence in their movements, as if they were working together to herd the group into a trap. "Over here," Ryan called, pointing to the door. He and Emily shoved a rusted metal cabinet out of the way, revealing a narrow exit. "Go, go, go!" Sarah squeezed through first, clutching her injured arm. Emily followed, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Ryan turned back to see Daniel still fighting, swinging the tire iron at another creature that had lunged too close. "Daniel, come on!" Ryan shouted. "Get them out of here!" Daniel yelled back, his voice strained. He dodged a swipe from one of the creatures, then brought the tire iron down on its arm with a sickening crunch. The creature screeched, retreating slightly, but two more took its place. Ryan hesitated, torn between helping Daniel and escaping. But the look in Daniel's eyes, a mix of determination and urgency, made the decision for him. He turned and darted through the exit, slamming the door shut behind him. Outside, the air was cold and damp, and the faint sounds of the creature's shrieks echoed through the night. The group found themselves in a narrow alleyway behind the warehouse, hemmed in by rusted fences and overgrown weeds. "Where's Daniel?" Emily asked, her voice quivering. "He's still inside," Ryan said, his face pale. We have to keep moving." "We can't just leave him," Emily protested. "If we stay, we're all dead," Ryan snapped, though guilt was etched across his face. "He told us to go. We need to honor that." Sarah leaned against the fence, her injured arm hanging limp at her side. "Which way do we go?" she asked weakly. Ryan scanned their surroundings, his eyes landing on a narrow path cutting through the weeds. "That way. If we can get to the main road, maybe we can find help." The group began moving, their footsteps crunching against the gravel. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made them jump, their eyes darting toward the shadows. The adrenaline was wearing off, replaced by exhaustion and the grim realization of their situation. As they stumbled through the path, Emily couldn't stop glancing back toward the warehouse. The thought of Daniel alone in there, fighting those things, made her stomach twist. She opened her mouth to say something when a deafening crash echoed behind them. They all froze. "What was that?" Sarah whispered. Ryan turned, his flashlight beam barely piercing the darkness. In the distance, they could see the warehouse crumbling in on itself, as if something massive was tearing through it. The faint outline of a creature larger than the ones they had seen before emerged from the wreckage. "It's bigger," Emily said, her voice trembling. "It's bigger than the others." "Run!" Ryan shouted. They sprinted down the path, the larger creature crashing through the undergrowth behind them. Its massive form moved with unnatural speed, and its growls sent shivers down their spines. The group burst onto the main road, their shoes skidding against the asphalt. The creature barreled out of the trees, its glowing eyes locking onto them. It let out a roar that seemed to shake the ground. "What do we do?" Sarah cried, tears streaming down her face. Ryan spotted an old utility truck parked on the side of the road. "There!" he shouted, leading the group toward it. The truck's windows were cracked, and its paint was peeling, but it looked intact enough to drive. Ryan yanked the door open and climbed into the driver's seat, frantically searching for keys. "Please, please, please," he muttered, under his breath. Emily and Sarah climbed into the passenger seat, their eyes fixed on the creature, which was closing in fast. Ryan flipped the sun visor down, and a set of keys fell into his lap. "Yes!" he shouted, jamming the key into the ignition. The truck roared to life just as the creature reached them. It slammed into the side of the truck, rocking it violently. "Hold on!" Ryan shouted, flooring the gas pedal. The truck lurched forward, its tires squealing against the road. The creature chased after them, its massive claws tearing into the asphalt. The truck gained speed, and for a brief moment, it seemed like they might escape. But then, the creature leapt, landing on the roof with a thunderous crash. The metal buckled under its weight, and its claws began tearing through the ceiling. "It's on us!" Emily screamed. Ryan swerved the truck violently, trying to throw the creature off. It clung to the roof, its claws puncturing through the metal. Pieces of debris rained down into the cab as the ceiling caved in slightly. "We need to get it off," Ryan shouted. Emily grabbed a wrench from the floor of the truck and swung it at one of the creature's claws, which had pierced through the roof. The creature shrieked, recoiling slightly, but it didn't let go. "Faster!" Sarah cried, clutching her injured arm. Ryan pushed the truck to its limit, the engine roaring as the speedometer climbed. The creature's claws tore deeper into the roof, and it let out another ear-splitting roar. Just ahead, Ryan spotted a low-hanging overpass. An idea sparked in his mind. "Hold on," he shouted. "What are you doing?" Emily yelled. Ryan didn't answer. He steered the truck straight toward the overpass, the creature still clinging to the roof. At the last second, he ducked, and the truck shot under the overpass. The creature wasn't as lucky. Its massive form slammed into the concrete, and it was ripped from the roof with a sickening crunch. The truck swerved wildly as Ryan fought to regain control. Finally, it skidded to a stop on the side of the road. The group sat in stunned silence, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. "Is it gone?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ryan looked in the rearview mirror. The creature's crumpled form lay motionless in the road behind them. But just as relief began to wash over them, its glowing eyes flickered open. "It's still alive," Emily said, her voice trembling. The creature began to move, its broken body twisting and contorting in unnatural ways as it stood. It let out a guttural growl, its glowing eyes locking onto the truck once more. "Drive," Sarah whispered. "Ryan, drive." Ryan slammed on the gas, the truck roaring to life as they sped away, but in the pit of his stomach, he knew the truth. They couldn't outrun it. The truck roared down the highway, its engine straining as Ryan floored the gas pedal. The creature was behind them, its massive form moving with an unnatural, jerky speed that defied logic. Even with its body twisted and broken, it seemed unstoppable, its glowing eyes fixed on the fleeing vehicle. "We're not going to make it," Sarah cried, clutching her injured arm. Ryan gritted his teeth, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. "I'm not giving up." Emily leaned out the passenger window, clutching the wrench she had used earlier. Her hands were trembling, but her eyes were filled with determination. Ill-distracted, She yelled over the roar of the engine and the pounding of her heart. "Emily! No!" Ryan shouted, but she didn't listen. As the creature gained on them, Emily swung the wrench at the rearview mirror, shattering the glass. The shards scattered onto the highway, glinting in the dim moonlight. The creature stumbled slightly as it stepped on the jagged debris, letting out a piercing shriek. "It worked!" Emily shouted, retreating back inside the truck. "Not for long," Ryan muttered. He glanced at the fuel gauge. The needle, E, was perilously close to empty. "Guys," Sarah said weakly, her voice barely audible over the chaos. "We need a plan. Fast." "There's nowhere to go," Ryan snapped. "We're in the middle of nowhere." "Then we find somewhere," Emily shot back, her voice firm despite the fear in her eyes. She scanned the darkness ahead, desperately searching for anything, a building, a bridge, a ditch, anything that might offer even a glimmer of hope. Then she saw it. "There," she shouted, pointing toward a faint light in the distance. "It's a gas station or something." Ryan squinted, barely making out the outline of a small structure illuminated by a flickering neon sign. He didn't hesitate, veering off the highway onto a dirt road leading toward the building. The truck jolted and rattled as it sped over the uneven terrain, but Ryan didn't slow down. The creature followed, its guttural growls growing louder. It was closing the gap again, its clawed hands reaching out toward the truck's rear bumper. "Faster!" Emily screamed. "I'm going as fast as it'll go," Ryan yelled back. The truck skidded to a stop in front of the gas station, the tires kicking up a cloud of dust. The building was old and decrepit, with boarded-up windows and a sagging roof. A flickering sign above the door read, "Jimmy's Diner open 24/7, though it was clear no one had been here in years. "Out! Inside, now!" Ryan shouted, yanking the keys from the ignition. The group scrambled out of the truck and sprinted toward the diner. The creature roared, crashing through the overgrown weeds and abandoned fuel pumps as it gave chase. Ryan threw his weight against the diner's front door, which creaked loudly but held. The group tumbled inside, slamming the door shut and locking it with a rusted bolt. "Find something to block the door," Daniel barked, his voice strained. Emily and Ryan grabbed a heavy table, dragging it across the floor and propping it against the door. Sarah collapsed into a chair, clutching her bleeding arm as her breaths came in shallow gasps. The creature slammed into the door, the force shaking the entire building. The bolt held, but the wood groaned ominously under the pressure. "It's not going to hold," Emily cried, her voice rising with panic. Ryan scanned the room, his eyes landing on an old jukebox in the corner. "Help me move this," he shouted. Emily and Ryan pushed the heavy machine against the table, reinforcing the barricade. The creature roared again, slamming into the door with even greater force. Cracks began to spread across the wood. "It's going to break through," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not if we can slow it down," Daniel said. He grabbed a fire extinguisher from the wall and positioned himself near the door. "When it comes through, aim for its eyes. Blind it." Emily grabbed a jagged piece of broken glass from the floor. Ryan picked up a rusty kitchen knife he had found behind the counter. They were exhausted, terrified, and hopelessly outmatched, but they weren't going down without a fight. The door finally gave way with a deafening crash, splinters flying in all directions. The creature lunged into the diner, its massive claws tearing through the barricade like it was paper. "Now!" Daniel shouted. He sprayed the fire extinguisher directly at the creature's face. A cloud of white foam engulfed it, momentarily blinding it. The creature roared in frustration, swiping wildly at the air. Emily darted forward, slashing at its glowing eyes with the shard of glass. The creature reared back, its shrieks shaking the walls of the diner. "It's working!" Ryan shouted, jabbing at its torso with the knife. The blade barely pierced its tough, leathery skin, but it was enough to drive the creature back a few steps. The team pressed their advantage, throwing everything they had at the monster. Daniel swung the empty fire extinguisher like a club, while Emily and Ryan attacked with their improvised weapons. For a moment, it seemed like they might have a chance, but then the creature regained its footing. It lashed out with its claws, sending Daniel crashing into a wall. He groaned, clutching his side as blood seeped through his shirt. "Daniel!" Emily screamed, but she had no time to help him. The creature turned its attention to her, its glowing eyes filled with rage. She stumbled backward, tripping over a chair and falling hard onto the floor. The creature loomed over her, its claws raised to strike. Suddenly, a loud noise echoed through the dinner, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to shake the very air. The creature froze, its head snapping toward the sound. "What was that?" Sarah whispered, her eyes wide with terror. The growl came again, louder this time, and it was followed by a sound none of them expected. Heavy footsteps. Something else was coming, and it was big. The creature let out a hiss, its glowing eyes darting toward the shattered door. For the first time, it looked afraid. The team exchanged bewildered glances as the heavy footsteps grew closer. The ground seemed to tremble beneath them, the sound growing louder and louder until it was deafening. Then, with a deafening crash, the wall opposite the door exploded inward, sending debris flying across the room. Dust filled the air, obscuring their view, but through the haze, they could see the outline of something massive. The creature that had been hunting them screeched and backed away, retreating toward the shadows. "What is that?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling. The dust began to settle, revealing the silhouette of a monstrous figure, easily twice the size of the creature they had been fighting. Its eyes glowed even brighter, and its body was covered in thick, jagged armor-like scales. It let out a deafening roar, shaking the diner to its foundation. The first creature darted toward the window, scrambling to escape. The larger creature lunged, grabbing it with massive claws and slamming it into the ground. The team watched in stunned silence as the two monsters clashed, their roars echoing into the night. "We need to get out of here," Ryan said, his voice barely audible. Emily nodded, helping Daniel to his feet. "But where do we go?" "No idea," Ryan said, glancing nervously at the battle unfolding before them. "But wherever it is, it's far away from here." The ground trembled beneath their feet as the two monstrous creatures clashed. The larger one let out a guttural roar, slamming the smaller creature into the diner floor with such force that cracks spread across the tiles. The team watched in stunned silence, their bodies frozen with fear and exhaustion. Ryan snapped out of it first. "Move!" he shouted, grabbing Emily by the arm and pulling her toward the shattered door. "We're sitting ducks if we stay here?" Emily helped Daniel, who was limping badly, while Sarah stumbled after them, clutching her injured arm. They darted through the wreckage of the diner, dodging overturned tables and broken glass as the monsters fought just feet away. The smaller creature screeched, its claws raking across the larger one's armored chest. Sparks flew as the talons scraped against the thick scales, but the larger creature barely flinched. It retaliated with a vicious swipe, its massive claws tearing through the smaller creature's side. A spray of dark, foul-smelling liquid hit the wall, sizzling as it ate through the paint. Emily gagged at the smell. "What is that? Acid? Don't stop to find out," Ryan shouted, kicking aside a chair that blocked their path. They burst out into the open air, the cool night breeze a stark contrast to the stifling atmosphere inside the diner. But their relief was short-lived. The fight inside continued to escalate, and the building groaned under the strain of the creature's relentless attacks. "It's going to collapse," Sarah cried, glancing back at the crumbling diner. Ryan spotted an abandoned pickup truck parked a few yards away, its driver's side door hanging open. "There!" he shouted, sprinting toward it. He yanked the door open and jumped inside, frantically searching for keys. "Please, not again," Emily muttered, as she helped Daniel into the truck's bed. Sarah climbed in after him, her movement sluggish and pained. Ryan flipped down the sun visor, and once again, a set of keys fell into his hand. "Lucky twice," he muttered, jamming the key into the ignition. The engine sputtered but didn't start. "Not this time," Emily groaned, climbing into the passenger seat. She pounded the dashboard in frustration. "Come on!" Ryan turned the key again, his heart pounding. The engine roared to life, and he slammed his foot on the gas. The truck jerked forward, its tires kicking up dirt as they sped away from the diner. Behind them, the larger creature roared, lifting the smaller one and slamming it into the ground. The impact sent a shock wave through the earth, and the diner collapsed in on itself, a cloud of dust and debris rising into the air. "Did you see that?" Sarah said, her voice shaking. "That thing was massive." Ryan kept his eyes on the road. "I don't want to see it again. Ever." "Where are we even going?" Emily asked, glancing nervously out the window. "We don't know where those things are coming from. They could be anywhere. We need to put as much distance as we can between us and them," Ryan said. "If we find a town," maybe his words were cut off as a deafening roar echoed across the night. Emily twisted in her seat, looking out the back window. In the distance she could see the larger creature stepping out of the rubble of the diner, its glowing eyes scanning the horizon. "It's coming," she whispered. Ryan pushed the truck harder, the speedometer needle climbing. "How is it so fast?" he muttered, glancing in the rearview mirror. The creature was covering ground at an alarming rate, its massive claws digging into the earth with every stride. "What do we do?" Sarah cried, panic rising in her voice. "Keep driving," Ryan said through gritted teeth. "That's all we can do." The road ahead curved sharply, and Ryan struggled to keep the truck steady. The tires screeched as he took the turn too fast, the vehicle nearly tipping onto two wheels. Behind them, the creature roared again, the sound vibrating through their chests. "We need a plan," Emily shouted. "We can't just keep running." "I'm open to suggestions," Ryan snapped, his eyes darting between the road and the rearview mirror. Emily glanced out the window, her mind racing. The terrain was rocky and uneven, with steep hills rising on either side of the road. An idea struck her, though it was risky. "There," she said, pointing to a narrow path leading up one of the hills. "If we get off the main road, maybe it'll lose us." Ryan hesitated. "That's a dirt trail. We'll get stuck. We'll get caught if we stay here," Emily argued. "Just do it." Ryan veered off the road onto the trail, the truck bouncing violently as it climbed the uneven path. Rocks and dirt flew from the tires as they ascended, the incline growing steeper with every yard. Behind them, the creature slowed, its massive size making it harder to navigate the rugged terrain. It clawed at the hillside, trying to maintain its balance as it pursued them. "It's working," Emily said, her voice filled with cautious hope. "It's slowing down." But the trail was getting narrower, the edge of the cliff dangerously close. Ryan's hands shook as he gripped the wheel, trying to keep the truck from sliding off. "This better be worth it," he muttered. Suddenly, the truck hit a large rock, jolting violently. The engine sputtered and the vehicle came to an abrupt stop. "No, no, no!" Ryan shouted, slamming his hands against the steering wheel. "What happened?" Sarah asked, panic in her voice. "We're stuck," Ryan said, trying to restart the engine. The axles probably bent or something." The creature roared again, its glowing eyes visible through the darkness. It was climbing steadily, its movements slow but deliberate. "We have to move," Emily shouted, jumping out of the truck. Daniel groaned as Emily and Sarah helped him out of the bed. "I can't run," he said, his voice weak. "Well, find somewhere to hide," Emily said, her voice firm. "We're not leaving you." The group scrambled up the hillside, their legs burning as they climbed. The creature was gaining ground again, its growls growing louder. At the top of the hill, they found a small cave, its entrance partially hidden by overgrown brush. Emily pushed aside the branches, gesturing for the others to go inside. "Hurry," she urged. They ducked into the cave, their breaths ragged and their bodies trembling. The interior was dark and damp, the walls lined with jagged rocks. Emily crouched near the entrance, peeking out to watch the creatures progress. It reached the top of the hill, its massive form silhouetted against the night sky. For a moment it seemed to hesitate, sniffing the air as if searching for their scent. "Do you think it'll find us?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. Emily didn't answer. She watched as the creature prowled near the cave entrance, its glowing eyes scanning the area. It let out a low growl, its claws raking against the rocks. Then, without warning, it stopped. Its head snapped to the side, its eyes focusing on something in the distance. "What's it looking at?" Ryan asked, his voice trembling. Emily followed the creature's gaze, her heart sinking as she saw what it had noticed. In the far distance, a faint light flickered, the unmistakable glow of a campfire. "There's someone else out there," she said, her voice filled with dread. The creature let out a deafening roar and charged toward the light, leaving the group trembling in the cave. "They don't know what's coming," Sarah whispered. Ryan turned to the group, his jaw set. "We have to warn them." Ryan's words hung in the damp air of the cave. No one moved at first. The idea of leaving their fragile shelter, let alone heading toward the same direction the creature had gone, seemed like madness. "Warn them?" Sarah said, her voice shaking. "Are you out of your mind? We barely survived that thing." Ryan locked eyes with her. "If we don't warn them, they're as good as dead. You saw that light? Whoever's out there doesn't know what's coming." Emily, crouched near the cave's entrance, peeked out again. The creature was almost out of sight, moving toward the flickering glow in the distance. Her stomach twisted. "Ryan's right," she said, swallowing hard. "We can't let anyone else get hurt. Or we could die trying," Sarah snapped, clutching her injured arm. "Look at us. We're exhausted, hurt, unarmed, and out of options. Running toward that thing is suicide." "Well, be careful," Ryan said, his tone urgent but firm. "Stick to the shadows. Move quietly. We're not fighting it. We're just getting close enough to warn whoever's out there." Daniel, still leaning heavily on the cave wall, groaned softly. "I can't run anymore," he said, his voice weak. "You'll have to go without me." "No," Emily said immediately. "We're not leaving you." Ryan shook his head. "You're not coming. You're staying here with Daniel." "What?" Emily said, standing up. "No way." "If you're going, I'm coming." "Emily," Ryan said firmly, "Daniel needs someone to watch him. If anything happens while we're gone—" His words trailed off, the implication clear. Emily's jaw tightened, but she nodded reluctantly. "Fine. But you have to promise you'll come back." Ryan nodded, though he wasn't sure he believed it himself. He turned to Sarah. "You in?" She hesitated, staring at him like he'd lost his mind, but after a moment she sighed. "If we're doing this, we need a plan." The plan was simple: get close enough to the campfire to warn whoever was there, then retreat before the creature noticed them. As Ryan and Sarah crept down the hillside, the light grew brighter, flickering through the trees. The distant sound of voices reached their ears, maybe 3 people, talking and laughing. They sounded relaxed, unaware of the danger barreling toward them. Ryan's heart sank. These people had no idea what was coming. "Stay low," he whispered to Sarah. We can't let it see us. The forest was eerily quiet apart from the crackle of the campfire and the occasional crunch of leaves underfoot. They moved slowly, keeping to the shadows. The creature's guttural growls grew louder as they approached. It was too close. Ryan motioned for Sarah to stop. He crouched behind a thick tree trunk and peered out, his breath catching in his throat. The creature stood just outside the ring of firelight, its massive frame hunched and still. The Campirs, a young man and woman in their 20s, and an older man who looked like a guide, were seated around the fire, their backs to the monster. The glow of the flames danced on their faces as they chatted, oblivious to the horror looming behind them. Ryan's hands clenched into fists. "We have to do something," he whispered. "How?" Sarah hissed. "If we yell, it'll see us. If we get closer, we're dead." Ryan scanned the area, his mind racing. Then he spotted a pile of rocks a few yards away. An idea sparked. "Distract it," he whispered to Sarah. "Throw something. Make noise away from the camp." "What?" Sarah whispered back, her voice incredulous. "That's insane." "Just trust me," Ryan said, his eyes pleading. "It's their only chance." Sarah hesitated, then nodded. She grabbed a fist-sized rock and crept to the edge of the tree line, keeping low. She drew her arm back and hurled the rock into the underbrush on the opposite side of the camp. It landed with a loud thud, followed by a rustling sound. The creature's head snapped toward the noise, its glowing eyes narrowing. It let out a low growl and began stalking toward the sound, its claws digging into the ground. Ryan seized the moment. He darted out of the trees and into the firelight, his heart pounding as he approached the stunned campers. "Get up! Now!" he hissed, waving his arms. The young woman screamed, scrambling to her feet. The older man stood, confused. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded. "No time," Ryan said, his voice urgent. "There's something out here. It's coming for you. You have to run." The young man looked past Ryan, his face going pale. "What? What is that?" Ryan turned. The creature had realized the noise was a distraction. It was standing at the edge of the firelight now, its massive frame illuminated in all its horrifying detail, its glowing eyes locked onto Ryan, and it let out a deafening roar. "Run!" Ryan shouted. The campers didn't need to be told twice. They bolted into the woods, the older man leading the way. Sarah emerged from the shadows, motioning frantically for Ryan to follow. "Go! Go! Go!" she shouted. The group sprinted through the forest, branches slashing at their faces and feet, slipping on the uneven ground. The creature roared behind them, its heavy footsteps shaking the earth. It was faster than they had anticipated, and it was gaining. Ryan glanced back, his stomach dropping as he saw the creature closing in. It leapt, landing just feet away from the group. Its claws raked across the ground, narrowly missing the older man. "Split up," Ryan yelled. "It can't follow all of us." The group scattered, darting in different directions. Ryan sprinted toward a dense cluster of trees, weaving between the trunks. The sound of the creature's growls grew fainter, but his relief was short-lived. Ahead, the ground suddenly dropped away into a steep ravine. Ryan skidded to a stop, his heart hammering. The creature's roars echoed through the forest, and he knew he didn't have much time. He looked around, spotting a large, hollowed-out tree nearby. Without thinking, he dove inside, pressing himself against the rough bark. He held his breath, every muscle in his body tense. The creature's footsteps thundered closer. It stopped just outside the tree, its glowing eyes scanning the area. Ryan could hear its ragged breaths, the sound sending chills down his spine. It sniffed the air, growled, and then turned, stalking back toward the forest. Ryan didn't move. He stayed in the tree, his heart pounding, until the sound of the creature faded into the distance. Only then did he crawl out, his legs trembling. In the silence that followed, a new sound reached his ears, a faint electronic crackle. He fumbled in his pocket and pulled out a walkie-talkie. It was Daniel's, left behind in the rush. Through the static, a voice came through, distorted but unmistakable. "They're not the only ones." Ryan's blood ran cold. He gripped the walkie-talkie tightly, his mind racing. What did that mean? Who was speaking? And worse, who were they? Ryan's grip on the walkie-talkie tightened as the distorted voice crackled again, cutting through the eerie silence of the forest. "They're not the only ones," it repeated, followed by static. Then the voice added, "Get out while you still can." He stared at the device, his chest heaving. The words sent a chill down his spine, and his thoughts raced. Who was speaking? And what did they mean by not the only ones? The sound of distant footsteps brought him back to reality. Heavy, deliberate, and getting closer. He shoved the walkie-talkie into his pocket, scanning the area for a way out. The forest was dense, and the moonlight barely filtered through the thick canopy above. He crouched low, moving as quietly as he could toward the ravine. The hollowed tree he had hidden in was too exposed now. The creature could double back at any moment. Meanwhile, back at the cave, Emily crouched near Daniel, her ears straining for any sound. The forest around them had grown deathly quiet, and that silence was more unnerving than the creature's roars. "Do you think they're okay?" she asked softly, glancing at Daniel. Daniel, pale and weak, shook his head slowly. "They'll manage. They have to." His voice was faint, but his eyes reflected the same determination that had kept them alive this long. Emily didn't reply. Her mind raced, torn between waiting for Ryan and Sarah to return and the urge to go after them. Every minute that passed made her anxiety grow. She glanced at the cave entrance, where shadows seemed to shift unnaturally in the faint moonlight. Her hand brushed against the jagged piece of glass she had tucked into her jacket earlier. It wasn't much, but it was all she had. She gripped it tightly, her knuckles white. A faint sound echoed from deeper within the cave's soft, rhythmic tapping. At first she thought it was her imagination, but when it came again, louder this time, her stomach dropped. "Daniel," she whispered, inching closer to him. "Do you hear that?" He nodded weakly. "It's coming from inside." The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. Their focus had been entirely on the danger outside, but they had never considered what might be lurking within the cave. Emily helped Daniel to his feet, his weight heavy against her shoulder. "We need to move," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Now." Daniel groaned, wincing as he tried to steady himself. They moved toward the entrance as quickly as they could, the tapping growing louder with every step. It wasn't just tapping. It was accompanied by a wet, slithering sound that made Emily's skin crawl. They had almost reached the entrance when the sound stopped abruptly. The sudden silence was more terrifying than the noise itself. Emily turned, her heart pounding, and froze. Something moved in the shadows at the back of the cave. A pale, skitsi. A little hand reached out from the darkness, followed by another. A figure began to emerge, crawling toward them with an unnerving, spider-like motion. Emily didn't wait to see more. "Run!" she shouted, practically dragging Daniel toward the exit. They burst out of the cave just as a guttural growl echoed behind them. Emily glanced back, her blood turning to ice. The creature that had emerged from the cave was smaller than the one that had attacked the diner, but no less horrifying. Its pale skin glistened in the moonlight, and its glowing eyes were fixed on them. Emily didn't stop. She pulled Daniel along, their footsteps pounding against the rocky hillside as the creature gave chase. Daniel stumbled, nearly pulling them both down, but Emily tightened her grip on him, adrenaline driving her forward. Ryan and Sarah, still separated from the others, had found a narrow trail that led them closer to the campfire. The creature that had pursued the campers was nowhere in sight, but the unsettling silence made Ryan uneasy. "What's the plan?" Sarah whispered, her voice hoarse. Ryan glanced around, his mind racing. "Find the campers. Make sure they're okay. Then we regroup." "Regroup where?" Sarah asked. "We've lost track of the others." "We'll figure it out," Ryan said, though the uncertainty in his voice was clear. They followed the trail until they reached a small clearing. The remnants of the campfire were still smoldering, but the campers were gone. Scattered belongings, a backpack, a water bottle, and a flashlight lay abandoned on the ground. "Where are they?" Sarah asked, panic rising in her voice. Ryan picked up the flashlight, inspecting the ground. The dirt was disturbed, with deep grooves and claw marks leading away from the campsite. "They ran," he said grimly, "but I don't think they got far." Sarah covered her mouth, her eyes wide with fear. "We're too late." Ryan was about to respond, when a loud snap echoed through the forest. Both of them turned toward the sound, their muscles tensing. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered. Ryan nodded, gripping the flashlight tightly. He clicked it on, the beam cutting through the darkness. The light landed on a nearby tree and the figure standing behind it. It was the younger camper, his face pale and his eyes wide with terror. He stepped out cautiously, his hands shaking. "You're alive," Ryan said, relief washing over him. "Where are the others?" The camper shook his head, tears streaming down his face. It got them. I don't know where they are. I just ran." "Did you see which way it went?" Ryan asked, his voice urgent. The camper nodded, pointing toward the denser part of the forest. "That way. But I think there's more than one." Sarah's face went pale. "More?" Before Ryan could respond, a blood-curdling scream pierced the night. It came from the direction the camper had indicated. Ryan's blood ran cold. "Stay here," he said, handing the camper the flashlight. "Don't move." "What are you doing?" Sarah hissed. "You're not seriously going after it, are you?" "I'm not leaving anyone behind," Ryan said, his jaw set. He took a step toward the sound, but before he could move further, the ground beneath them began to shake. A low, rumbling growl echoed through the forest, louder and deeper than anything they had heard before. "What now?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. The trees ahead began to sway, their trunks bending as something massive pushed through. Ryan's heart pounded as a new figure emerged. A creature even larger than the one from the diner, its body covered in thick, jagged scales that glinted in the moonlight. Its glowing eyes scanned the clearing, and its massive jaws opened in a deafening roar. The camper screamed and bolted into the woods. Sarah grabbed Ryan's arm, pulling him back. "We can't fight that," she said. "We have to run." Ryan nodded reluctantly. "Go, it'll cover you." They turned and ran, the creature's thunderous footsteps shaking the ground beneath them. Ryan glanced back and saw it closing the distance with terrifying speed. This wasn't just a chase, it was a hunt. Up ahead, Emily and Daniel stumbled into view, their faces pale and streaked with dirt. Emily's eyes widened as she saw Ryan and Sarah running toward them. "What the hell is that?" she screamed, pointing at the massive creature. "Run now, questions later," Ryan shouted. The group fled together, their paths converging as the monster roared behind them. The terrain grew rougher, the forest denser, but they pushed forward, adrenaline fueling their every step. Finally, they reached the edge of a cliff. Below them, a wide river roared, its waters churning violently. Ryan skidded to a stop, his chest heaving. "Jump!" he shouted. "What? Are you crazy?" Sarah cried. "It's our only chance," Ryan said, turning to face the others. The creature's growls grew louder, closer. "Now!" Without waiting for a response, he grabbed Emily's hand and jumped, plunging into the icy water below. The rest of the group hesitated only for a heartbeat. Daniel, too weak to make the jump himself, was helped by Sarah, who wrapped an arm around him and leapt, shouting a wordless cry as they plunged into the roaring river. The cold hit like a wall, stealing their breath as the current swept them away. The massive creature reached the edge of the cliff and let out a deafening roar. Its glowing eyes tracked the group in the churning water below, but it hesitated to jump. Instead, it clawed at the edge of the cliff, its guttural growls echoing through the night. Ryan struggled to keep his head above water, the force of the current pulling him downstream. He caught sight of Emily nearby, gasping and coughing as she fought the river's pull. "Grab onto something," he shouted, though his voice was barely audible over the roaring water. Up ahead, jagged rocks jutted out of the river like broken teeth. Ryan kicked furiously, angling toward the shore. He caught sight of a fallen tree limb protruding from the water and reached for it, his fingers slipping on the slick bark before finally finding a grip. Emily was swept past him and he reached out, grabbing her arm just as she began to sink. "Hold on," he yelled, pulling her toward the limb. Behind them, Sarah and Daniel struggled together. Sarah had wrapped her good arm around Daniel, who was barely conscious, his head bobbing weakly in the water. "Help!" she screamed, her voice hoarse. Ryan and Emily worked together, pulling Sarah and Daniel toward the makeshift lifeline. It took everything they had, but finally, all four clung to the tree limb, their bodies battered and freezing. The creature roared again, its glowing eyes glaring down at them from the cliff. It paced back and forth, frustrated, before letting out a furious shriek and disappearing into the trees. For a moment, there was only the sound of the rushing river and their ragged breaths. "Is everyone okay?" Ryan asked, his voice shaking from the cold. Emily nodded weakly. "Alive, for now." Daniel groaned, his eyes barely open. Sarah, shivering uncontrollably, held onto him tightly, her injured arm bleeding again. "We can't stay here," she said through chattering teeth. "We need to find shelter." Ryan scanned the shore, his vision blurred from exhaustion. The riverbank was rocky and steep, but there was a narrow path that led up to a dense grove of trees. "There," he said, pointing. "Well, climb up and figure out our next move." It took every ounce of their strength to drag themselves out of the water and up the slippery bank. By the time they reached the top, they were soaked, freezing, and utterly spent. The forest provided some cover from the wind, but it was dark, and every shadow felt alive. Ryan helped Daniel lean against a tree while Emily ripped part of her jacket to wrap Sarah's bleeding arm. "This will have to do for now," she said, her voice shaky. Sarah winced but nodded. "We need to keep moving. If that thing, or things, are still out there, we can't stop." Ryan glanced at the walkie-talkie, which was still tucked in his pocket. The voice from earlier echoed in his mind. They're not the only ones. He turned to the group, his face grim. "We need to figure out what's going on. That voice on the walkie-talkie, it knew something. Whoever it was, they might have answers." "Answers?" Sarah said, her voice bitter. "What good are answers if we're dead?" "They're the only thing that might keep us alive," Ryan shot back. "If there are more of those things out there, we need to know what we're dealing with." Emily looked between them, her expression torn. "How do we even begin to figure this out? We're stranded in the middle of nowhere, with no gear, no weapons, and no time," Sarah interrupted. "If we wait too long, those things will find us." Ryan's jaw tightened. "We move toward higher ground, find a place to regroup. We'll use the walkie-talkie, see if that voice comes through again. Someone out there knows what's going on, and they might be able to help." The group reluctantly agreed, their exhaustion giving way to the primal need to survive. As they began their slow, painful trek uphill, the forest around them seemed to shift. Every sound-a-snapping branch, a rustle of leaves, felt like a threat. They didn't see the glowing eyes watching them from the shadows, nor the pale figures that followed silently, waiting for their chance to strike. V. The climb was grueling, each step feeling heavier than the last. The soaked clothing clinging to their bodies sapped what little warmth and strength they had left. The trees grew denser as they ascended, their twisted branches forming eerie shapes in the moonlight. Ryan led the way, his grip on the walkie-talkie tightening with each passing minute. Emily stayed close behind, helping Daniel as best she could while Sarah trudged along, clutching her injured arm. "What if the voice doesn't come back?" Emily asked, breaking the heavy silence. "It will," Ryan replied, though his voice lacked confidence. "It has to." A branch snapped somewhere behind them, loud and deliberate. The group froze. Ryan raised a hand to signal silence, his eyes scanning the dark forest. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. Ryan nodded. "Stay close. Keep moving." They pressed on, their pace quickening despite their exhaustion. The sound of footsteps followed them, growing louder, more insistent. Whatever was out there was trying to stay hidden anymore. "We're being followed," Emily said, her voice trembling. "I know," Ryan muttered, glancing back over his shoulder. His flashlight beam swept across the trees, but nothing was visible. The footsteps stopped when the light passed, resuming the moment darkness returned. They reached a rocky outcrop that jutted out over the forest. The view was vast, but offered little comfort. Trees stretched endlessly in every direction, and the faint glow of the river wound through the darkness below. "This is as good a place as any," Ryan said, motioning for the group to stop. "We need to figure out what's out there." "We know what's out there," Sarah hissed. "Those things." Ryan shook his head. "No, there's something else." The voice on the walkie-talkie wasn't one of them. "Someone knows what's going on. Someone we don't even know if we can trust," Sarah shot back. "We don't have a choice," Ryan said, his voice rising. "We're out of time, out of options." A guttural growl cut him off, freezing the group in place. It was close, too close. Ryan slowly turned toward the sound, raising his flashlight. The beam caught a figure standing just beyond the tree line. It was one of the smaller creatures, its pale skin gleaming and its glowing eyes locked on the group. Behind it, another pair of glowing eyes appeared. Then a knot? Her. "They're surrounding us," Emily whispered, gripping Daniel tightly. Ryan scanned the area, his mind racing. "We can't stay here. We need to—" The walkie-talkie crackled to life, cutting through the tension. The same distorted voice came through, clearer this time. "You're not safe there," it said. "Run to the caves above the ridge. They won't follow you inside." Ryan brought the device to his mouth, his voice shaking. "Who are you? How do you know this?" "Do as I say," the voice replied. "You're running out of time." The static faded, leaving them in stunned silence. "Do we trust it?" Sarah asked, her eyes darting between Ryan and the advancing creatures. "We don't have a choice," Ryan said, echoing his earlier words. "Let's go." He led the way toward the ridge, the others close behind. The creatures followed, their growls growing louder, more frenzied. The group scrambled over rocks and tree roots, their breath coming in ragged gasps. "Faster!" Ryan urged, glancing back. The creatures were gaining, their glowing eyes cutting through the darkness. Emily stumbled, nearly pulling Daniel down with her. Ryan rushed to help, but one of the creatures lunged, swiping at her with its claws. The strike missed by inches, but it was enough to send her sprawling. "Emily!" Ryan shouted, swinging his flashlight at the creature. The beam hit its face, and it recoiled with a hiss. Emily scrambled to her feet, and they kept moving, their fear driving them forward. The ridge loomed ahead, a steep incline with jagged rocks and sparse vegetation. At the top, a dark opening was visible, a cave, just as the voice had said. "There!" Ryan shouted. "Get to the cave!" The group pushed themselves to their limits, climbing the ridge as the creatures closed in. Sarah slipped, her injured arm giving out, but Emily grabbed her, pulling her up with surprising strength. Almost there, Emily gasped. The first creature, it reached the base of the ridge, its claws digging into the rock as it climbed. Its glowing eyes burned with hunger, its guttural growls echoing in the night. Ryan reached the cave first, pulling Emily and Sarah inside. Together, they helped Daniel, who collapsed just as they crossed the threshold. The creatures were mere feet away, their claws scraping against the rock. Ryan grabbed a loose boulder near the cave entrance and shoved it into place with the others' help. It wasn't a perfect barricade, but it would have to do. The creatures reached the entrance, their glowing eyes glaring through the gaps in the rocks. They growled and hissed, clawing at the barrier, but they didn't try to force their way inside. "What's stopping them?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," Ryan said, stepping back from the barricade. His heart was pounding, but for the first time in hours, they weren't being chased. The walkie-talkie crackled again. "They won't come in," the voice said. "You're safe, for now." Ryan raised the device to his mouth, anger and desperation spilling out. "Who are you? How do you know about this? What's going on out here?" There was a long pause, and for a moment, Ryan thought the voice wouldn't answer. Then it spoke, low and deliberate. "They're hunters," it said. "They don't stop. And this forest is their territory." "Hunters?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. "What are they hunting?" "Anything that moves," the voice replied. "But you've done more than just wander into their territory. You've disturbed something ancient." "What do you mean?" Ryan pressed. "What's going on here?" The voice didn't answer. Instead, the static returned, louder this time, almost deafening. Ryan pulled the walkie-talkie away from his ear, frustration boiling over. "We need answers," he shouted at the device. The static abruptly stopped, and the voice returned, colder now. "Look behind you." The group froze. Slowly, they turned to face the dark depths of the cave. A faint glow was visible, far in the distance, and the sound of tapping echoed once again. "They're not the only ones," the voice said. Then the walkie-talkie went dead. The cave was deathly silent except for the faint, rhythmic tapping echoing from its depths. The dim glow flickering far in the distance seemed to pulse in time with the sound, casting eerie shadows along the jagged walls. "They're not the only ones," Ryan repeated the voice's ominous warning under his breath. His grip on the walkie-talkie tightened, his knuckles white. "Ryan," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "What do we do now?" "We don't go deeper," Sarah said firmly, cradling her injured arm. "Whatever that is, we don't want to find out." Daniel, leaning heavily against the wall, managed to speak, his voice faint. "The creatures outside didn't follow us in. Maybe it's because of that." "That's comforting," Sarah muttered, her eyes darting nervously toward the glowing light. "What if it's worse than what's out there?" Ryan swallowed hard, his mind racing. "We can't stay here forever. If they're waiting outside, they'll wear us down until we make a mistake. And if we try to run, we don't stand a chance." "So what?" Emily asked, her voice rising with panic. "We walk toward whatever that is and hope it doesn't kill us?" Ryan hesitated, his gaze fixed on the faint glow. "I don't think we have a choice." The group exchanged uneasy glances, their exhaustion and fear mirrored in each other's faces. Finally, Ryan took a deep breath and stepped forward, the beam of his flashlight cutting into the darkness. "Stay close," he said, his voice steady despite the dread coiling in his chest. "If something happens, we get out as fast as we can." Emily helped Daniel to his feet, her arm wrapped tightly around his waist to support him. Sarah brought up the rear, clutching a jagged rock shed picked up as an improvised weapon. The tapping grew louder as they moved deeper into the cave, echoing off the walls in a way that made it impossible to pinpoint the source. The air grew colder, the damp smell of moss and earth intensifying with every step. The glow ahead grew brighter, flickering like the light of a fire. It cast long, shifting shadows on the walls, creating the illusion of movement where there was none. "What is that?" Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. They rounded a bend, and the source of the light came into view. It was a circular chamber, the walls covered in strange glowing symbols that pulsed with a soft, amber light. In the center of the room stood an ancient stone altar, its surface slick with what looked like dark, dried blood. Around the altar were skeletal remains, human judging by the shapes, though they were twisted and contorted in ways that defied anatomy. "What the hell is this?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Ryan approached the altar cautiously, his flashlight beam sweeping over the symbols. "It's some kind of ritual site," he said, though the words felt inadequate. Emily's gaze fell on the bones scattered around the altar. These people, they didn't just die. They were sacrificed. The rhythmic tapping suddenly stopped, plunging the cave into an oppressive silence. The group froze, their breaths shallow, as a low, guttural sound rose from the shadows at the edge of the chamber. Ryan swung his flashlight toward the noise, and the beam caught movement, something large and hunched, its pale skin glistening in the amber light. It wasn't like the creatures outside. This one was bigger, its form twisted and grotesque, with elongated limbs and sharp, jagged teeth that glinted as it let out a guttural hiss. "Oh my God," Emily whispered, backing away. The creature stepped closer, its glowing eyes fixed on the group. Behind it, more figures emerged from the darkness, their movements jerky and unnatural. There were 5 of them, each as horrifying as the first. "They've been waiting," Daniel said, his voice weak but filled with grim understanding. "This place, it's a trap." The creatures advanced, their claws clicking against the stone floor. Ryan raised the flashlight, his heart pounding. "Back to the entrance," he shouted. "Now!" They turned and ran, their footsteps echoing in the narrow tunnel as the creatures gave chase. The rhythmic tapping resumed, faster this time, like a heartbeat pounding in their ears. The light from the cave entrance came into view, a faint glimmer of hope in the suffocating darkness. But as they approached, the outline of the barricade came into focus, and the glowing eyes of the creatures waiting just outside. "They're still there," Sarah cried. Ryan skidded to a stop, his mind racing. They were trapped between the creatures in the chamber, and the ones outside were dead, Emily said, panic overtaking her. "No," Ryan said, his voice firm despite the terror in his chest. "We're not done yet." He turned, facing the creatures advancing from the chamber. They had slowed, their glowing eyes fixated on the group as if savoring the hunt. Ryan's flashlight beam flickered, the bulb struggling to stay lit. "Get ready to fight," he said, gripping a loose rock from the ground. "We're not going down easy." Emily and Sarah armed themselves with whatever they could find, more rocks, sharp fragments of bone. Daniel, too weak to stand, leaned against the wall, his eyes fixed on the advancing monsters. The first creature lunged, and Ryan swung the rock with all his strength. It connected with a sickening crunch, sending the creature staggering back. But another one was already upon him, its claws slashing toward his chest. Emily screamed, hurling a rock at the second creature. It struck its shoulder, but the monster barely inched. It turned toward her, its jagged teeth bared. Suddenly, the walkie-talkie crackled to life again, the distorted voice cutting through the chaos. "The altar," it said. "Use the altar." Ryan didn't hesitate. He grabbed the device, shouting into it as he fought off another creature. "What do we do?" "Activate it," the voice replied. "You'll know how." Ryan turned toward the chamber, his mind racing. "Cover me," he shouted, breaking away from the fight and sprinting toward the altar. "Ryan!" Emily screamed, but he didn't stop. The glowing symbols on the walls pulsed faster as he approached, their light growing blindingly bright. The creatures hissed, their movements faltering as if the altar's energy repelled them. Ryan reached the stone surface, his hands trembling. There, in the center of the altar, was a jagged knife made of obsidian, its edge glinting in the amber light. He grabbed it, feeling a strange warmth emanating from the blade. The voice crackled through the walkie-talkie again. "Offer blood. It's the only way." Ryan's heart pounded. He hesitated, the weight of the blade heavy in his hand. Behind him, the creatures screeched, their glowing eyes fixed on him. "Do it!" Emily screamed. "Whatever it takes." Ryan raised the blade, his mind racing with fear and desperation. He gritted his teeth and slashed his palm, letting his blood drip onto the altar. The symbols flared to life, their amber light turning a fiery red. The creatures let out deafening screams, their bodies contorting as the energy from the altar consumed them. The ground shook violently, and the walls of the cave began to crack. Ryan stumbled back, clutching his bleeding hand as the chamber filled with blinding light. Then, everything went silent. When the light faded, the cave was eerily still. The creatures were gone, their twisted forms reduced to nothing but ash scattered across the stone floor. The glowing symbols on the walls had dimmed, their fiery red hue replaced by a faint amber pulse, like embers dying out after a fire. Ryan collapsed to Essie knees beside the altar, his chest heaving. Blood dripped from his palm onto the stone, the warm crimson pooling in the grooves carved into its surface. "Ryan!" Emily's voice cut through the silence. She sprinted toward him, her face pale but determined. She grabbed his uninjured hand, helping him to his feet. "Are you okay?" He nodded weakly, though his legs felt like jelly. "I think so." Sarah and Daniel joined them, both looking as shaken as Ryan felt. Sarah stared at the altar, her eyes wide. "What just happened? What did you do?" I don't know," Ryan admitted, glancing at the blade in his hand. The obsidian knife still pulsed faintly, as though it was alive. The voice said to offer blood. "I didn't have a choice." Daniel, leaning heavily against Emily, looked around the chamber. It worked. "Whatever this thing is, it's powerful, and it saved us." "But for how long?" Sarah asked, her tone laced with fear. "What if they come back? Or worse, what if we just made something else angry?" The walkie-talkie crackled again, and the voice returned, calm but urgent. "You've bought yourselves time, but you're not safe yet." Ryan raised the device to his mouth, frustration bubbling to the surface. "Who are you? Why are you helping us? And what the hell is going on out here?" There was a pause, followed by a sigh. "You deserve answers," the voice said. "But this isn't the place for them. Get out of the cave. Head east. There's an abandoned outpost about 3 miles from here. It'll explain everything there." Ryan frowned, his instincts screaming not to trust the stranger. "Why should we believe you?" "Because you're alive," the voice replied, "and because the alternative is staying here." The static cut off, leaving them in silence once more. Emily looked at Ryan, her expression conflicted. "Do we trust them?" Ryan glanced at the altar, then back at his injured hand. The voice had been right so fair, had guided them through every life-threatening moment, and while he hated relying on a stranger, they had no other options. "We don't have a choice," he said finally. "If there's a chance they can tell us what's going on, we have to take it." Daniel nodded weakly. "Let's just hope we don't regret it." They began their slow journey back toward the entrance of the cave. The barricade they had hastily built was still intact, but the creatures outside were gone. The forest beyond was eerily quiet, the moonlight casting long shadows across the rocky ridge. Sarah glanced around nervously. Why would they leave? They were waiting for us before. Maybe the altar scared them off, Emily suggested, though her voice wavered. Or maybe they're regrouping. Ryan shuddered at the thought but kept moving. We need to keep going. The sooner we get to this outpost, the better. The group descended the ridge, the rough terrain slowing their progress. Daniel leaned heavily on Emily, his strength fading with every step. Sarah lagged behind, her injured arm wrapped tightly in the makeshift bandage. The walk was grueling, their exhaustion weighing on them like a physical burden. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a branch sent their hearts racing, but the forest remained empty. Whatever had been hunting them seemed to have vanished. After nearly 2 hours, they spotted a structure through the trees, a squat, weathered building made of concrete and corrugated metal. Faded military markings were visible on the walls, and the chain-link fence surrounding it was rusted and partially collapsed. "Is that it?" Emily asked, her voice filled with a mix of hope and apprehension. "It has to be," Ryan said, quickening his pace. They approached the building cautiously, their eyes scanning the area for any signs of danger. The door was slightly ajar, hanging crookedly on its hinges. Ryan pushed it open, his flashlight revealing a small, dimly lit room filled with abandoned equipment and scattered papers. The walkie-talkie crackled again, startling them. "You made it," the voice said. Ryan raised the device. "We're here. Now talk. Who are you? And what's happening out here?" There was a long pause before the voice replied. "I was part of a research team sent here 5 years ago. We were studying the creatures you've encountered. They're not from this world." "What do you mean, not from this world?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. "They're ancient," the voice continued, "older than humanity. We don't know where they came from, but they've been here long before us. They've stayed hidden, mostly, but something has disturbed them." Ryan frowned. "The altar. It had blood on it already. People have been here before us." "Yes," the voice said. "And they were sacrifices. The altar keeps the creatures contained. But only for a time. When it runs dry, they hunt again." Sarah stepped forward, her face pale. "Why would anyone come out here knowing that?" "Not everyone knows," the voice replied. "But those who do, sometimes they're desperate. Other times, they're curious. And sometimes, they're just unlucky. Like you." Ryan's frustration boiled over. "How do we stop this? How do we survive?" The voice hesitated. "You've already done the first step by reactivating the altar, but there's something else, something deeper in the forest, something connected to their origins. If you want to end this, you'll have to destroy it." "Destroy what?" Ryan demanded. The voice didn't answer. Instead, the static grew louder, and then the walkie-talkie went silent. "No, no, no," Ryan shouted, shaking the device. "Come back. We need answers." Emily placed a hand on his arm, her expression grim. "They're gone, Ryan. But at least we know more than we did before." "Yeah," Sarah said bitterly. "We know we're in way over our heads." Ryan set the walkie-talkie down, his jaw clenched. "We can't stop now. If we leave, this will just happen again to someone else. We have to finish this." The others looked at him, their exhaustion clear, but one by one, they nodded. "Then we go deeper," Emily said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "And we end this. This content may violate our usage policies. Did we get it wrong? Please tell us by giving this response a thumbs down." The forest loomed darker than ever, its ancient trees twisting into grotesque shapes that seemed to reach for the group as they trudged deeper into the unknown. Their steps were uneven, their bodies battered and weary, but none of them spoke about turning back. The faint hope of stopping the creatures and surviving was all they had left. Ryan led the way, gripping the obsidian knife tightly in his hand. Its faint warmth was a strange comfort, a reminder of the power they had unleashed in the cave. Emily walked beside him, her eyes scanning every shadow. Behind them, Sarah supported Daniel, who had grown weaker with each step but refused to stop. The directions from the voice in the walkie-talkie were vague, but they followed the most overgrown trail, a path that felt untouched by human feet for decades. The air grew heavier the farther they went, each breath carrying the faint metallic tang of blood. "What exactly are we looking for?" Sarah asked, her voice a whisper. Ryan didn't look back. "Something connected to their origins, something we can destroy." "Great," Sarah muttered. "We're just wandering around hoping to find some ancient monster lair." Emily shot her a warning look. "Stay focused. We've made it this far." They pressed on in silence until the forest began to change. The trees thinned, their bark darker and twisted as if scorched by fire. The ground beneath their feet turned black and cracked, and the air reeked of decay. "What is this place?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling. Ahead, a faint glow appeared, flickering like the light of the altar but far more menacing. As they approached, the ground sloped downward into a massive clearing. In the center stood a stone monolith, ancient and weathered, covered in the same glowing symbols they had seen in the cave. Around it, the earth pulsed with a faint red light, as if alive. The sight made Ryan's stomach churn. The monolith radiated a malevolent energy, and the very air around it seemed to hum with power. "That has to be it," he said, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at him. Emily pointed to the base of the monolith, her eyes widening. "Look!" The ground around the stone was littered with bones, human and animal, their forms twisted and broken. Dark stains marred the earth, remnants of countless sacrifices. Standing amidst the carnage were more of the pale creatures, their glowing eyes fixed on the monolith. They moved slowly, almost reverently, as if drawn to its power. "There are too many," Sarah whispered. "How do we get past them?" Ryan gripped the knife, his jaw tightening. "We'll find a way." Before anyone could respond, a deafening roar echoed through the clearing. The creatures froze, their heads snapping toward the sound. From the shadows of the forest emerged one of the massive creatures they had encountered before, its glowing eyes burning with rage. It stalked toward the monolith, its claws tearing into the ground. The smaller creatures parted for it, bowing their heads as it passed. It reached the base of the monolith and reared back, letting out another ear-splitting roar. The glow of the monolith flared brighter, casting an eerie red light across the clearing. Ryan's grip on the knife tightened. "That's it," he said. "That's what we have to destroy." "Are you insane?" Sarah hissed. "That thing will tear us apart before we even get close." Ryan turned to Emily. "The altar worked because of blood. This knife there's something about it. It might be the key to stopping all of this." Emily looked at the knife, then at the monolith. Her fear was clear. "But," she nodded. "Then we do it. We end this." Daniel, leaning heavily on Sarah, managed to speak. "You will need a distraction." Ryan shook his head. "No way." "You're in no condition. I don't need to fight," Daniel interrupted, his voice weak but firm. "Just to buy you time. You focus on getting to the monolith." Emily hesitated, then placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "You better survive this too." He gave her a faint smile. "No promises." Ryan turned to the group. "Stick together. If this works, we might not have long to get out of here." Without another word, they moved into position. Daniel, supported by Sarah, picked up a heavy branch and struck it against a nearby tree. The sound echoed through the clearing, drawing the attention of the creatures. "Over here," Sarah shouted, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. "Come and get us." The smaller creatures hissed, their glowing eyes locking onto the source of the noise. They began moving towards Sarah and Daniel, their clawed hands scraping against the ground. The massive creature, however, remained by the monolith, its attention fixed on the pulsing stone. Ryan and Emily crept around the edge of the clearing, staying low to avoid detection. The closer they got to the monolith, the heavier the air became. The ground beneath their feet felt hot, pulsing with the same energy as the stone. Finally, they reached the base of the monolith. Up close, the symbols glowed so brightly it was almost blinding. The obsidian knife in Ryan's hand pulsed in response, as if alive. "What now?" Emily whispered. Ryan stared at the monolith, his instincts screaming that this was the source of everything. He raised the knife, the blade catching the red glow. "We end it." Before he could strike, the massive creature turned, its glowing eyes locking onto them. It let out a deafening roar, its body surging toward them with terrifying speed. "Ryan, look out!" Emily screamed, shoving him out of the way just as the creature's claws slammed into the ground where he had been, standing. Ryan rolled to his feet, the knife still in his hand. The creature loomed over him, its jagged teeth bared. It swiped at him again, and he barely dodged, the blade catching its arm in the process. The creature roared in pain, dark liquid oozing from the wound. "Keep it distracted," Emily shouted, grabbing a rock and hurling it at the creature's head. The monster turned toward her, its eyes blazing with rage. It lunged, and Emily dove out of the way, scrambling to put distance between herself and the beast. Ryan seized the moment. He gripped the knife tightly and drove it into the base of the monolith. The blade sank into the stone with surprising ease, and the glowing symbols flared brighter than ever. The ground shook violently, and the monolith let out a deep, resonant hum. The creatures in the clearing shrieked, their bodies convulsing as the light from the monolith engulfed them. The massive creature let out one final roar before collapsing, its form disintegrating into ash. "Ryan!" Emily shouted, her voice barely audible over the chaos. "The whole place is collapsing." Ryan yanked the knife from the monolith, the glowing symbols flickering and fading. The ground beneath them cracked and split, red light pouring from the fissures. "Run!" Ryan shouted, grabbing Emily's hand. They sprinted toward the edge of the clearing, dodging falling debris and collapsing ground. Sarah and Daniel appeared through the trees, their faces pale but alive. "Move!" Sarah screamed. "This whole place is going under." The group ran together, the forest behind them collapsing into a fiery abyss. The pulsing glow of the monolith faded into the distance, and the air grew still. When they finally stopped, gasping for breath, the forest was silent. The oppressive hum was gone, replaced by the quiet rustle of leaves in the wind. "Is it over?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. Ryan looked. At the knife in his hand, the obsidian blade dull and lifeless. He nodded. "It's over." But as the group stared into the darkness, a faint, rhythmic tapping echoed from the distance, sending chills down their spines. "Or maybe not," Sarah whispered. The rhythmic tapping grew louder, sending a wave of dread through the group. Ryan gripped the now dull obsidian knife tighter, his jaw clenched. The forest around them, though quiet moments ago, now seemed alive again, the shadows twisting unnaturally as the sound approached. "We stopped the monolith," Emily said, her voice trembling. "We stopped it, didn't we?" Ryan scanned the darkened woods, his mind racing. The altar in the cave, the sacrifices, the monolith, they were all connected. But if the creatures were gone, what could this new sound mean? His eyes darted to Daniel, who was leaning heavily on Emily for support, his breathing shallow. "We can't stay here," Ryan said firmly. "We need to keep moving." "And go where?" Sarah asked, her tone sharp with exhaustion and fear. "We're running on fumes. Daniel's barely holding on, and whatever that is, it's coming for us." The tapping echoed again, closer now. It was deliberate, almost mechanical, and yet it sent the same primal fear coursing through them as the creatures had. Ryan stared at the obsidian knife in his hand, its weight feeling heavier than before. The blade's faint warmth was gone, but the memory of the power it held lingered. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "Whatever we did, it wasn't enough." Sarah's face twisted with anger and despair. Then what was the point? We destroyed the monolith, we risked everything, and now what? We're right back where we started. "No," Ryan said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. "We've weakened them. The creatures, the monolith, whatever force controlled them, it's on its last legs. This sound, it's something different. Maybe the last piece of the puzzle. Or the last nail in our coffin," Sarah muttered, but she followed, as Ryan led the way deeper into the forest. The tapping grew louder with each step, accompanied by a faint glowing mist that hung low to the ground. The air grew colder, the metallic tang returning and stinging their noses. Emily shivered, pulling Daniel closer to keep him steady. Finally, the source of the sound came into view. The group froze, their breaths catching in their throats. In a small clearing ahead stood a figure. It was tall and humanoid, but its features were blurred, as if not entirely there. Its form flickered, shifting like a mirage, and its movements were slow and deliberate. In its hand was a staff, the base of which struck the ground rhythmically, creating the tapping sound. Ryan instinctively raised the knife, though he knew it might not help. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice trembling but firm. The figure stopped, its head tilting slightly as if considering him. Then it spoke, its voice layered and echoing as if coming from multiple directions at once. "You've meddled with forces far older than you," it said. "You've disturbed the balance." Ryan stepped forward, his heart pounding. "We didn't ask for this. Those creatures, the monolith, they attacked us. We did what we had to do to survive." The figure tilted its head the other way, an unnerving gesture. "Survival comes with a cost," it said. "You have disrupted the seal. The balance is broken." "What balance?" Emily demanded, her voice rising with desperation. "What are you talking about? What seal?" The figure raised its staff, pointing it toward the distant horizon. "The altar, the monolith. They are remnants of an ancient pact. The creatures you fought are guardians, bound to this place to protect the world from what lies beneath." Ryan's stomach dropped. What lies beneath? The figure's form flickered, and for a moment its outline seemed more solid, more menacing. "The true darkness," it said simply. "You have opened the way." Silence fell over the group as the weight of the figure's words sank in. The faint tapping resumed as the figure began to fade, its outline dissolving into the mist. "Wait!" Ryan shouted, stepping forward. "How do we stop it? How do we fix this?" The figure's voice echoed one final time, disembodied now, as it disappeared completely. "The balance must be restored, but the cost may be more than you are willing to pay." As the last traces of the figure vanished, the group was left standing in the cold, empty clearing. The tapping was gone, but the dread lingered, heavier than ever. Emily turned to Ryan, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. "What does that mean? Restore the balance? What cost?" Ryan shook his head, his jaw clenched. "I don't know." The forest grew silent again, but it was the kind of silence that felt alive, watchful. The shadows seemed to stretch farther, reaching toward them as if the forest itself had changed. "What now?" Sarah asked, her voice small. Ryan looked at the knife in his hand, the blade now as cold and lifeless as the world around them. He tightened his grip, his eyes hardening with resolve. "We keep moving," he said. "We find the next piece of this puzzle, and we finish what we started." "And if we can't?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. Ryan met her gaze, his expression unyielding. "Then we fight until we can't fight anymore." The group set off again, their figures disappearing into the darkness of the forest. The faint glow of the mist lingered behind them, and in the distance the rhythmic tapping resumed, soft and patient, as if waiting for them to make their next move. The balance was broken, the true darkness was stirring, but they weren't done yet, and neither was the forest.